this particular toolkit and body of work that Jane is going to be sharing with you is it really encapsulates several key ways in which we have been doing that and how we could do it more effectively in the future. And in particular, to think through the consequences of what is a technical and social possibility as a key way of how we become opinionated and how we form that opinion to extend the agency that we want to give to our users into forums where those users themselves don't have a lot of control. So with that, I'd like to welcome up Jane. She's going to give a little bit of a talk, and then some Mozillians are going to react. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you. With like a country music background too, which is a first for me. Thanks for coming out today. Thanks for being with us online today. So I'm Jane McGonigal. I'm a director of game research and development at the Institute for the Future. And my work focuses on finding ways to help people whose full-time job is not to be a futurist, to give them opportunities to develop some foresight skills and participate in the process of figuring out what kind of future we want to make. And so this tool that we're going to be talking about today, the Ethical Operating System, is designed to engage a very diverse and inclusive ecosystem of people who make tech, use tech, and are affected by tech in the conversation about the long-term consequences of what we are building and using. And I think the best way to explain the purpose of this toolkit and how it's meant to work is to tell a little story about the future. And this is actually a story about the future that has a happy ending, which is really weird because futurists don't usually get to tell stories with endings because we're talking about things that haven't happened yet. But sometimes, as Miriam and I were just discussing, the present and the future are so close and things happen so quickly with new technologies that you actually get all kinds of plot twists and surprise endings while you feel like you're still talking about something that's emerging. So the story I wanted to talk to you about was, it started last May. You may have witnessed this really kind of surprising tech demo from out of Google, this new vocal autonomous agent. Did you guys see this duplex when it was demoed? And so what was really surprising about this is Google kind of out of nowhere demonstrated that they had a vocal agent that could speak so naturalistically and engage in a goal-oriented conversation with a human being that did not know it was an autonomous agent. It could get things done, and it had been programmed really to be so persuasively human. It had upspeak, it said like and and kind of two things happened when this demo occurred. First, anyone familiar with AI said, oh my God, this is an amazing advance. We didn't know we were this close to something so naturalistic. And at the same time, there was a kind of concern also. So you started to see a lot of headlines like, Google Duplex scares me. People can no longer tell when they're chatting with a robot. What have you done? Headlines like, people are so terrified by this human-sounding assistant. Google's AI advances are equal parts worry and wonder. And it started to emerge pretty quickly that most people had a kind of funny feeling in their stomachs when it comes to the idea that tech companies might be intentionally deceiving us or making technology that could deceive us as to whether we're talking to a human or robot. And out of that sense of unease, some pretty interesting conversations started to happen. As people started to say, is this an ethical and moral technology? You had academic researchers, you had technology journalists, you had engineers within tech companies starting to have conversations about what might go wrong in a future where we had vocal agents that could persuade us they were human and accomplish tasks in a matter of convince us to do things by talking to them. So people started to wonder, how might this be used as a kind of propaganda? How might it be used in unethical marketing? How might it be used for harassment? And suddenly we started to have very clear ethical concerns and risks that people could move from a state of kind of unease, the sort of dystopian feeling, but I don't know why I feel this way, to actually articulating things that could be acted on, resolved, and regulated. And the reason why I say this is kind of a story with a happy ending is that 3 days after this demo, after this explosion of public collaborative conversation, Google announced a new internal policy that it would adopt from now on. Its vocal agents would always identify themselves as bots. And this would help not only with transparency, you're talking to a bot, but also let you know that because this AI is trying to get smarter, your conversation will be recorded. So the privacy issues were also addressed directly. And it gets even better because 5 months later, California passed a law that requires any bot to identify itself as such when it's involved in a marketing communication or a political communication. So here we have this ecosystem of tech companies doing innovations and sharing them, the public, researchers, journalists reacting, raising actual concrete concerns, and seeing both technology companies and regulators act quickly in response to pass regulations and internal policies that help us, I think, all breathe a little easier and feel like the future we're creating is not a Black Mirror dystopia, but one that we feel like we understand and we can embrace. And what this particular experience made me realize, and perhaps you will feel this way too, is that essentially we are all Mark Zuckerberg now. We are all going to be held accountable for the decisions that we make about the technologies that we build, the technologies that we adopted early, that we evangelized for, that we helped democratize and spread. And as a result, we should all be thinking about 10 years from now, will we be asked questions about why did you let this happen, or why did you support this, or why did you build this, or why did you popularize this? So we have an opportunity to kind of step up and have a little more foresight about what we're building and the consequences. I think most people working in technology now realize and accept the fact that most of the problems we will have in the future are going to be caused by the things that look like solutions to us today, right? And that there's a constant need to reassess and foresee where solutions might actually turn into risks. So who shares responsibility for this process? The ethical operating system is designed to broaden the conversation and allow more actors to be involved in developing foresight and calling for policies, regulations, or changes to the technology and the business models that are being popularized. So everyone from CEOs to investors, strategic planning teams, board members, product managers, engineers, researchers, journalists, students, the public. The goal is to allow all of these groups to collaborate and share insights to mitigate risk together. And specifically, we're calling out a number of public goods or common goods that we feel it's essential for anyone involved in technology to even informally adopt their own Hippocratic oath to say, first, we will do no harm to truth, democracy, rights to privacy, economic security, equality, mental health, public safety, and humanity's long-term well-being. The problem that we're trying to address with this toolkit is I think most people want to get behind this idea of making technologies that don't accidentally destroy the world. But the problem is the future will be different. One thing we know about the future is it's always different. It's hard to anticipate how things that we've never had direct experience with before will unfold and how they will affect each other at complex scales. So we need tech tools to allow us to see things we've never seen before, imagine things that are hard to imagine. If we're not trying to imagine things that we've never seen before, we run the risk of falling into a kind of long, dark period that I would describe as post-traumatic innovation, in which our imagination is really limited to solving the problems that we've just experienced and just been traumatized. You know, right now, we're seeing a lot of investment in addressing the issue of fake news, which is important to solve. But people who are behind fake news and were benefiting from it have already moved on to what the next wave of disinformation and propaganda and clickbaiting might be. So we're trying to see ahead to the next cycle so we're not playing this kind of constant catch-up game of trying to recover from traumas that have already been inflicted upon us. So one thing that the ethical operating system does to try to help people imagine things we haven't experienced before and get ahead of this cycle of kind of traumatizing consequences is to establish 8 different risk zones that we feel foresight developed in all of these risk zones will create the strongest possibility of being able to protect those public goods like truth and rights to privacy. And so what I thought I would do now is talk to you a little bit about some of these risk zones and some of the tools that we've created to help people foresee where these risk zones might go. These risk zones were generated out of things that we've already seen happening, the signals of new kinds of emerging consequences. And what we're trying to do with these tools is help people see what the next wave or what the next version might be. So for example, in the first risk zone for truth, disinformation, and propaganda, we have been traumatized by fake news. We've been traumatized by bots on social media being used for propaganda and disinformation. What might we look to next? One of the emerging spaces that we know people are trying to solve the risks of, but we don't quite have a clear picture of how this tech might be used in different contexts and exactly what we're trying to safeguard against are deep fake videos. So the technology has emerged to replace people's facial expressions, to replace the words coming out of their mouth, to make it look like people have said and done things that they've never done, whether it's in political speeches or pornography. It's being used in lots of ways that raise concerns about the social consequences. And interestingly, at Carnegie Mellon, just on the existing level of this deepfake technology, they found that it completely and convincingly fooled a third of test subjects just at the level of readily available deepfake technology today, where they were able to replace things that former President Obama had said with President Trump's face, and everybody totally believed that it was an authentic piece of media. So if the current level technology can fool a third of people, which is much higher rates of deception than we saw with fake news, it kind of makes you wonder where it might be going. And deepfakes are on people's radar. And so what we're doing with the toolkit is saying, what's next? In addition to needing to have a clear imagination about how a technology like deepfake videos might affect us, we need to be looking at all emerging tech to see what is the responsibility to truth on this technology, whether you are a health tracking sensor or you're working in the Internet of Things. We want people who are making these technologies to ask questions like, what is truth on your platform? What type of data do users expect you to accurately share, measure, or collect? How could bad actors use your tech to subvert or attack this truth? What would be the equivalent of fake news or bots or deep fakes on your platform? So we're asking companies and startups and technologists who might not be thinking that truth is actually a core value for their platform or their service to start to think ahead to how it might be used. And so we have this checklist of questions for every risk zone that we're putting in the hands of product managers and engineers and advisors so that these questions can become a part of the product development cycle, a part of long-term strategies, board conversations, and such. Another risk zone that I think is particularly interesting maybe to Mozillians, we're calling the surveillance state. So looking at the intersection of surveillance technologies and AI. The biggest signal here that I know everybody is tracking is the social credit system in China, which is actually more than one system. We've been doing a lot of research at the Institute for the Future, ethnographic research on all of the different credit systems. So depending on where you live in the country and what services you use, you might actually have 4 different scores or 10 different scores, and they're really experimenting with different scoring systems and finding out which ones create a sense of anxiety and dread and confusion, and which ones actually you see people seem to be happier and safer and healthier, and this what seems like a dystopic vision where you have a score that affects your ability to get access to healthcare or what schools you can go to or what trains you can ride in. Some people actually are saying this has improved our quality of life. And if that's the case, we may see this adopted outside of more authoritarian countries and experimented with in places like the United States, for example. What would that look like? This system is powered in part by a lot of facial recognition and cameras that are capturing people's activities so they can dock your score for doing things like walking in the middle of the street instead of the crosswalk. So we're tracking signals like Singapore is about to install 110,000 lampposts with facial recognition surveillance. And we're also seeing researchers putting out algorithms that claim to do things like detect if you are gay, which when you start to compare these signals and combine them in a place where homosexuality is against the law and they're putting facial recognition in cameras and want to know perhaps if you're gay, you can start to see where risks might emerge. And it's not just state actors. We have a surveillance advertising economy that we are all mired in now. And so we track signals like the fact that Walgreens wants to put facial recognition cameras in their cooler doors so that they can try to push you different products depending if they think you're old or young or male or female or whatever they can try to detect about you, what emotion you're feeling that day. And so thinking about the surveillance advertising economy as well in this risk space. We do see a lot of positive movement in this risk zone. For example, Microsoft actually asking the government to regulate how its technologies can be used. Microsoft doesn't want their tech to be used for crimes or oppression. And so actually putting out statements of what they expect in terms of transparency and recourse. That makes me optimistic that folks are addressing these concerns, but I think we need to use our imagination to really outline more than just the commonly accepted ways that this tech could go wrong. So we do ask questions of people in this space, trying to get a little more foresight. One of the questions that's been resonating with a lot of the companies that I've brought this toolkit to is the fourth question on the screen. Are you creating data that could follow users throughout their lifetimes, affect their reputations, and impact their future opportunities? Will the data your tech is generating have long-term consequences for the freedoms and reputation of individuals? I've seen a lot of kind of aha moments with tech companies who are tracking things that, if they became a part of your long-term personal profile, might change what opportunities you have. Risk Zone 6 is about this data control and monetization. The study that just was released, so it said that 3/4 of Americans don't realize how Facebook actually makes money, that do not realize that their online behavior is getting tracked and monetized. So even with all of the scandals and discussion around this, we're realizing that people don't know this is going on, and that itself is a risk for the future. We're seeing an emergence among the Internet of Things, more cases where people just are not aware of how their data is being collected and monetized. For example, the Kinsa thermometer, which if you have a fever, it sends that data to companies that may want to advertise, not just to you personally, but to your entire community. If there are a lot of people running fevers in San Francisco, they increase their ad spend there because they think a lot of people have the flu. But the people using this thermometer are not aware that they're a part of this data ecosystem. Certainly with genetic technologies, people are being surprised by how their data is being used, for example, in trying to solve cold cases where you thought you were just finding out about your personal ancestry, and now your entire family is being scrutinized for potential criminal activity, and you may not have even submitted your genetic data to this company, but if a cousin did or a cousin of a cousin did, they have enough information to actually know things about you as well. So we're starting to see companies and initiatives trying to play with this. Could we help you control your DNA information? Could we allow you to decide who gets to see it and how it's monetized? And Microsoft, again, is testing this interesting kind of secretive tech that I think Miriam knows even more about than I do and might be able to share about. But this idea that you could have a personal data bank and actually have access to any information that's been collected about you, and that you could decide who it's shared with, and you could participate in the monetization of it. I think shaking up the business models and the economic asset distribution around the data economy looks like it's going to be one of the most important strategies for companies that are data driven to avoid kind of social backlash or excessive regulation. Trust violations is kind of last risk zone I wanted to look at with you guys. And this is when technology does things that you don't know it's doing, or how do you bring the public along on emerging technology journeys so that there's not this kind of sense of fear or hysteria about them. Oh, this is actually a build. I don't know why it's not building, but it's interesting. If you type "is Alexa" in Google, the top search result for a long time, I don't know if this is still true today, the suggested result was "is Alexa listening all the time," which is indicative of how many people have this kind of paranoia about this new technology in our homes. We have these smart speakers that we think they're maybe are only listening and recording when we wake them up, but in fact, we're starting to realize that they're getting triggered by all kinds kinds of things and actually capturing more conversation information than we thought, such that last month when somebody requested, if you have any files that you've recorded of me talking to you, can you please send them to me? And was sent 1,700 conversations from a different user, so the user error at Amazon, but not only just revealed that there's kind of a lack of security about what these systems are picking up, the fact that they had 1,700 conversations, many of which were conversations between the customer and his wife, was kind of eye-opening. Like, we didn't know that all of this stuff was being recorded and kept and stored. So it's understandable that people have trust issues. And there was a really interesting New York Times long read about how in neighborhoods and communities where autonomous cars are being rolled out first, how the local community is reacting. The local community is wielding rocks and knives to attack these cars out on the road. The Waymo autonomous vehicles are frequently vandalized and essentially terrorized by the residents, and also kind of gamed. It's becoming increasingly common to try to brake or maneuver your car such that it confuses the Waymo car. So the residents are like actively trying to thwart the emergence of this technology. And so thinking about the long-term consequences of creating this tension between emerging tech and the residents that are affected by it and feel powerless. How do we bring people along in the journey so they can help participate in deciding how this emerging tech is rolled out and feel comfortable and safe and excited about it, and not overwhelmed and anxious and adversarial about it? And then, of course, Mozilla is doing really good work in this area to build trust, right? So I was excited to learn about the doctoral program for healthier IoT. If I didn't already have a PhD, I would be all over this and enroll. So it's great. So this will actually train technologists, designers, and researchers to create and advocate for a healthier Internet of Things, where our smart objects are more trustworthy, where the ecosystem is healthier. And so that kind of combined with all the dark things we're seeing makes me feel optimistic that we can have foresight and build healthier technologies. So another tool we have in the toolkit that I wanted to share with you before we kind of open this up to conversation are scenarios. So we find that people are better able to delineate specific risks and imagine how they might be affected by a technology, or how different groups might be affected by technologies, when there are really concrete worlds that are suggested. You know, could you be ready for a world in which a certain technology has achieved a certain scale and is being used for a certain purpose? So we created 14 scenarios, and we have some tools for essentially trying to draw out consequences and figure out who would benefit from this world, who would be at a disadvantage, how might people try to exploit it or game the system, who would be more anxious, how would they react as a result. And so I just want to share with you some of these scenarios so you can get a sense of how you might think about these risks in really concrete ways and be able to game out kind of bigger, complex consequences, systemic consequences. So one of our scenarios, it's about conversation bots, which have been trained to imitate specific people using data sets collected from public social media posts. These bots are deployed across social media networks, email and text messages, and super targeted, super personalized propaganda campaigns. So imagine a bot that could learn how to write like me or speak like me based on videos of me online and all of my social media posts, and could contact my husband or contact a fan of mine and pretend to be me and have conversations with them, or have online chats with them. Are we ready for this world? And what if these kind of fake people bots are highly effective in changing opinions and driving action, as these personalized messages appear to be from people's actual friends or their family or favorite celebrities? What should we do in that future? Are we ready for a world in which Fortune 500 human resource departments are subscribed to smart employer services that evaluate people's suitability for workplace cultures and stress levels using an assessment of these candidates' public social media posts and likes. I've been told repeatedly in the past few weeks, this is not a scenario. We're actually doing this. So all the more important to think about this. But these algorithms might be looking to identify susceptibility or current mental illness, things like depression, anxiety, sociopathy, and these are predictive services that may predict if a woman becomes pregnant, what's her likelihood of getting postpartum depression. That's an actual example I was told about something that's being used in human resource departments. So this data might be used to offer support and resources to employees. That could be a pro side. Recommend reassignment to different departments or tasks when necessary, and make hiring decisions. Another scenario, which we're so close to actually seeing be real, might be a major social network company purchasing a top bank and becoming the first social credit provider, basing its mortgage rates, its loan approvals, and credit access on deep data collected by its social platform, taking into consideration the credit histories of your friends and family, locations you visited, such as frequency of visits to places like bars and legal marijuana dispensaries, and semantic analysis of messages and photos to indicate whether you're generally happy, angry, anxious, or depressed, based on the idea that people who are anxious and depressed are less likely to pay back loans, or people who visit dispensaries and bars a lot are a higher credit risk. How about a world where facial recognition technology is a mainstream tool available to any individual or organization? You can subscribe to this database that will have 1 billion faces indexed and recognizable, and literally anybody building any kind of app or smart object could put a camera, put this facial recognition into it. So literally our dating apps, our shopping apps, our neighborhood apps, our games, facial recognition is a layer now everywhere. What might happen in that world? Are we ready for a world in which a major data aggregator offers free health insurance to anyone who agrees to install a smart toilet in their home and submit its data to the company? This scenario is based on a signal. We found a market research survey that found 70% of Americans would be willing to let Google or a similar company have access to their smart toilet data if they could have lower health insurance costs. So what would a company learn? Stress hormones, pregnancy, infectious diseases, alcohol and drug use, blood sugar level, any medications you're on, are you complying with prescriptions? Are you taking things you shouldn't be? And so this contract would allow them to monetize your data and use it however they want. Are we ready for that world? And I think the last scenario I was going to share, are we ready for a world in which 25% of online orders are delivered by drones, and these drones are fitted with cameras and other sensors to collect data as they fly over neighborhoods, providing an additional revenue stream for shippers and merchants who can sell this data or monetize it. And individuals who opt for free unlimited drone delivery are also consenting to the collection of data from their homes and yards. Entire neighborhoods where drone delivery is legally permitted are subject to the same data collection activities, even if you haven't actually ordered anything or signed up for this program. What might happen in this world? And what we do is we ask people to take these scenarios and compare them across the 8 risk zones and start to look for what are the risk zones for hate and harassment, what are the risk zones for economic inequality, what are the risk zones for truth and propaganda. So that's a little bit about how this toolkit works. And the toolkit's freely available. It's published with a Creative Commons license. It's online at EthicalOS.org, and it's being taught in universities. It's inside public policy departments at a lot of our tech companies. We have Techstars Incubator is having all of their founders across their network of startups use this and part of conversation with investors and their board of advisors. So we're starting to see a lot of pickup, and I'm really excited in working with Miriam here at Mozilla to think about how our tools might combine to allow broader sectors and all of these different actors in the ecosystem develop foresight together, because we can identify more risks together and we can identify more solutions together. So thanks for letting me share this tool with you, and I'm excited to hear how it intersects with the rest of Mozilla's work.
Thank you, Jane.
Yeah.
So as Jane mentioned, so I have used parts of this toolkit with our DWeb explorations and our augmented reality explorations with the XR Studio participants. But one of the things that, I'm struck by at Mozilla is that we do actually have tools very similar to the ones that this toolkit suggests that companies build. And so when I reached out to Jane, I was like, hey, we have some tools that are actually really great tools that we would like other companies to use. So I'd like to invite Mika to come up first as sort of respondents. I'm going to ask a few Mozillians to come up and kind of respond to what Jane said, talk a little bit about the tools that we actually use to affect this kind of thinking and this kind of change in the industry. And any of you who are online, please hop into the ET Slack if you want to drop us a question or have a comment or a tool that that you use in your work here at Mozilla that helps you be more ethical and helps us develop technology in a more ethical way. Mika, please join us. Would you like to? Sit?
Oh, sure.
You can start to
okay.
Panel.
Can be in the middle. So thank you for this talk. I think that, I don't think I saw ethical and moral associated with companies like 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And yet I think the spike for me, at least, having worked in the space, it's like so obvious in the last 6 months. I think Facebook really caused that to become like, where did the ethics go? And I think this is really interesting because there's social norms that people have. You expect your children not to be hateful, or in some places to recycle. And we expect our schools and our families and sort of social norms in different countries to kind of impose that and discuss that so that happens. And I'm not sure where we lost it in companies, but I wonder if it is, like you were saying, there's a point where today and tomorrow merge. And some of our technologies have just accelerated so fast that it's already here. Many of these scenarios you said, and for the way that I think about it, it's really there's software that can do amazing things. It's doing these things for people, and it's powered by data. And so something that the toolkit that we've been using at Mozilla that we developed, it's called Lean Data Practices. Lean Data Practices really evolved over the years. Mozilla's been involved in so many different technologies over the years, but we've always had our mission, and we've always had our data privacy principles, and that really guided us. And that was sort of our ethics, or our shining star of morality, and where we fell as we develop products. And Lean Data Practices, the toolkit, was really our findings and testing on ourselves that we decided, well, we're an open source company. This can be open to really anybody. And the way that toolkit is set up is, when you're thinking through privacy and security, there are 3 main tenets to that we think. One is data minimization, which is not to say you shouldn't collect any data, but it's to be really, really thoughtful about what data is necessary for the things that you want to do. And then on top of that, because maybe you need highly sensitive data for that, are there alternatives? Are there other ways to get the value that you're seeking, but with less data? And then the data that you have, does it need to live forever? As you said, there's a lot of long-term consequences to something sitting around forever. So data minimization is a piece of that. Applying appropriate security, some of the examples that you referenced, there's a lot of sharing, there's a lot of usage. And the Lean Data Practices sort of methodology is like really honing into what is necessary for that particular set of data and the particular app or technology. Like, really think about this at some point in your product development process. And then the last pillar of Lean Data Practices is user engagement. And that really goes to a lot of the examples you showed where people are like, I had no idea that my conversations with my husband over whatever we were arguing about was actually picked up and then sent to the wrong person on top of that. And I think this is like something that each company for their product or app has to decide, like, uniquely, how do you solve that? Because every company right now is like, oh, we have a privacy policy. That's what GDPR was all about, and we complied, and we've got our privacy policy. But we know, and actually we've done our own testing on our own products, yes, you should have a privacy policy, but very few people are going to read that, and maybe it doesn't make any sense. And so really, like, just-in-time notifications, maybe throughout the life cycle of the product, because I opened up my new, shiny thing, and then I threw out the box, and then everyone else in my family started using it. They never even had the opportunity. And then we're just doing our life. Like, where is the time to really sit back and think about this? And so Lean Data Practices, that's really what it's about. One thing, I'm really curious, as you have talked to other companies, the feedback you've been getting? Because with lean data practices, we've been talking with companies, we've been talking with big companies, large companies, startups. And some things that I've heard that I don't have answers to, they're just observations. But you know, startups or companies, anything, someone's trying to solve a problem, someone has a great idea, and that's what they're focusing on with their team. And so it's like, the more we throw on, what are you doing with your data? Did you have a security review? How are you sharing it? Like, did you have that design is really crappy? Nobody understands it. There's all these elements. And I think I see sometimes companies like, do I have to do it? Can I do it later? Because I'm trying to build my thing. The second part of it is I'm trying to make money. And so we've heard this like angst from companies that are like, yeah, we actually want to do this. It's a ton of resources, it's a ton of time, and our board or our investors, they don't see the ROI. And so when do we slot the time to do that? Because we're under tremendous pressure to produce whatever. And so that's something, it's like, when do you slot in the time to be an ethical company? It seems like something, and that's where to me it's the analogy to children. It's something that we expect, it seems normal, but yet it got lost somewhere. So there's a lot of stuff I just said. Curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, can I borrow your microphone? Let me tell you a little bit about what we've been seeing with uptake and use. And so the first thing I should say is we developed the toolkit in collaboration with the Omidiyar Network's Tech Society Solutions Lab. And one of their theories of change about this product was that it would be used and popularized by people within the organizations like engineers and product managers, and they really wanted to diffuse throughout the kind of daily decision-making and thought processing of as many people within an organization as possible, because there does seem to be a moment in time we're in, as you just said so eloquently, where within organizations, people want to be making tech that they feel good about, they feel is responsible. And so you're starting to see employees push back against certain types of product work or customer usage of tech. And what companies are asking me is what's going to motivate this change, right? So one of the theories is that what will motivate it is people don't want to work for the new tobacco company. People don't want to make products that destroy people's lives. And so one of the theories is that if you can create tools that intersect with the kind of daily work practices of someone like a product manager and engineer, give them these simple tools like checklists and that are recommended to be used anytime you start a new product cycle or when this is what you do when you're about to move to scale, that it would basically infiltrate enough of the actual workforce that at every level decisions are being made more ethically. And we have some tools at the end of the toolkit for connecting that with other types of communities. My favorite idea from the toolkit is something kind of like an ethical bounty hunting. So around security flaws and security risks, both inside a company, people are empowered to raise the red flag when they see something, but also externally. If you're a hacker, you find a security flaw, you identify it through secure channels, you are, the companies will pay you, right? Because you essentially did a service by discovering and sharing that information. One of our ideas is to have essentially the same kind of ethical bounty, where if you identify a really important risk to a common good like truth or privacy or mental health and well-being, that you can communicate that through secure channels and possibly develop communities of people hacking these types of ethical issues. One of my personal pet projects is to have an EthCon, like DEF CON, where we would all come together in like Las Vegas and hack out the ethical consequences to essentially put pressure on companies. If you know about the risk, you will be liable for it. And maybe you didn't want to be an ethical actor, but now we can prove, historically speaking, that you were informed of this risk and you acted knowingly, which I think in terms of legal liability is an important lever also to put on companies.
I love that idea. Ethical bounty.
What else?
Yeah, so now I'm going to ask Sean, my boss, our Chief R&D Officer, to come up. And one of the things that I find that we're really wrestling with on a day-to-day basis in emerging technologies is how to make the future real enough that we can learn from it, but not so real that people can get harmed by it. And we've made that decision over and over again with many of the experimental proto products that we put out over the last year. And I've been really impressed by how you've listened to your teams when they're raising these ethical issues and saying, no, we can't release this in an open source software way now because it will be abused. And so I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about how you think about the pull of pessimism and optimism and how we get to that urgent optimism where we're aware of all of these risks, but we actually feel like we can do something about them?
Sure. Didn't know I was going to be up here, but happy to join you. And thank you very much. It's great to see the work that you've been doing. Ethical optimism. In some ways, I'm hoping that everybody who actually is joining Mozilla, working on some of these projects, working in any of the open source projects, has a certain sense of ethical optimism, right? And part of that's necessary for emerging tech, right? If you are primarily taking a purely defensive position, you are focusing on the things of the past. And there are so many challenges in the future that we're trying to look at. I think one of the examples that I think is still a challenge for me is how we get people to think about the longer time aspects of these, right? So maybe one example, there's some interesting writing around how we use narratives to try and convey environmental and geologic time. Right, because for the most part, we don't perceive it, right? Those of us who live in California, and I know we have people from across the world, Berlin and Vancouver, everybody joining in, but California folk generally are fairly aware of the fault lines that live underneath us. But if you didn't live through one of the particular earthquakes, you didn't really have a sense for what that meant. And as time goes on, it sort of disappears unless there's a little rumble. And that's certainly true for these larger environmental issues, right? So people who choose to believe or not believe in environmental change, right? And it feels that way for a lot of the things that we do in emerging technologies, is that, as you observed, those folks who are aware of the risks in the different zones of risk you have are keenly aware of them, and there are plenty of people who aren't, or they're making choices that are not necessarily going to impact that, right? So we often find that people will claim in a survey or in an interview that they would make a choice that enhances their privacy, protects their privacy, their security, but given the actual choice to make a purchase, pay for something, they don't. And so in the end, I mean, there used to be this saying for developers, we do the hard work so that the end user doesn't have to. And I think that is in spades here, where we are trying to actually find the pitfalls so that the end user doesn't have to. And there's a great example from our VR team, particularly the Hubs team. So we have this social VR experiment. And one of the things that they found from just early experience is that consent is an actual important issue, right? One that you would, it's the beautiful kind of design where it is obvious after you say it, but when you're first starting to build those things, it's not obvious. And I think, as you were pointing out, sometimes you don't find that out until you do some form of prototyping. I think one of the things that's been interesting for us is to see how much we can lean into prototyping through scenarios, the kind of work that Miriam is doing, or that you were showing from the Institute for the Future, right, where we actually game out scenarios and kind of understand that, versus the things where you might not find it out until you are actually building it and trying it out. And sometimes that's a heavy lift and hard work. So arguably, we are still trying to figure out what that balance is for both of those.
That's really interesting. We have a platform at the Institute called the Foresight Engine that I developed, where we will put a scenario up, usually in a video format, and then we'll invite people to say how they would feel and what they would do in that future. And my favorite Foresight Engine that we ran was a couple years ago with 10,000 high school students. And we made a scenario video about a social network that was drawing on neurosensing data and other biological measures to communicate your emotions, your emotional state. in real time to friends and family. And so we asked all these high school students, first of all, would you join the network? Who would you friend? Like, who would you allow to get your feels? Who would you block? Would you feel the feelings of somebody you like disagreed with? How do you think it would impact dating? How do you think it would impact politics? How might it impact prejudice or understanding? And they spent 48 hours, 10,000 high school students talking to each other, kind of gaming out. Oh, okay, if you had your parents, here's what might happen. Or if you were, had to feel what the people you were bullying felt, would that change your behavior? And they just gamed it out and gamed it out. I think it's like, for me, it's kind of like it's like ethnographic research on something that hasn't happened yet. But from what I've been able to observe from over 10 years of doing this, is people have a pretty accurate imagination when they're immersed in a scenario. It's like when you do a survey, like you said, it's, you say what you think is the right thing to say. But when you're in a social environment and other people are reacting and saying what they would do, and you're kind of, it's a more of an emotionally authentic immersion into these types of questions. It seems to me like we get pretty good data. And that was really eye-opening for me, that particular engine, because the main takeaway was this particular demographic is primed by the technologies they've used and the experiences they've had to give away that data to the network. They are ready to let the world know exactly what they're feeling and sensing because of all the things that they imagined it would do for them. And that was interesting. It made me think, like, we need to accept that something like this is more likely and therefore must be addressed more kind of aggressively as a potential risk base, because people seemed quite keen to just give it all up.
Well, and finding that balance is the part that we really want to explore, right? Because I think we're still aspirational that we give people new powers to either enhance their cognition, enhance their perception, as well as the safety as they go out into the world. Figuring out the combination of that. I don't see if we don't have a poster of this, but there is one image that one of our designers put together that sort of looks like like an Iron Man suit. That is a representation of Firefox. And one of the reasons I like it is because it's that combination of protection from the world, but also giving you the superpowers.
Yeah. Right.
Mika, you were...
It's something I was thinking of. You mentioned choices, like the choices people make in time, over time, versus at a point in time. And you mentioned, when in an immersive experience, given a little bit more understanding of consequences, the decision may change versus at the beginning. And this is something that I've been thinking about, in that a lot of our current cultural, especially on data, it focuses on data collection. And I think that misses the point a little bit about it's the use and the use over time. And especially if companies are like, okay, but I complied. I told people what I collected. That's on you if you didn't figure out the big picture. And this is something I've heard in lean data practices conversations in other parts of the world, where they're like, look, we are not European. Our culture, privacy is very different here, and people don't have the same expectation. And therefore, do we really need to do all of this? And there, I think, and it's not just me, I'm hearing others as well saying, well, we think companies have a responsibility to somehow figure out for yourself, impart a little bit of what could happen over time, so that the notices or the disclaimers are somewhere. It's not about what we're doing now, and this is the impact to you. And I think a great example for me that was eye-opening for me is when I learned how social like buttons work on the web. Because as just a random person on the web, and yes, I created a Facebook account years ago, I didn't understand that Facebook is having access to that unless each company and operator of that website does something different to limit that collection. And that's just an example of how a lot of people, especially in the context of Facebook, don't realize, and Facebook's always saying, but we told you, but they didn't tell you enough so that you really understand the magnitude. And I think that's for each company, even Mozilla. I think we should strive to do that more, but it's hard. I'm not going to say that's an easy thing.
I love the idea of flashing forward in a user agreement? Like, could we create these little flashcards when you sign up for new service that are not created by the company? They're like mandated by some third party that says if you're going to collect certain kind of data, you need to show these 5 scenarios real quick to the user. Because I think about like fitness trackers, for example, the location, the GPS tracking data. People are just starting to realize, because they're being used in criminal investigations and like, oh yeah, somebody has data on where I've been, and it could be used in ways that I wasn't anticipating. Yes, if we could start, like, I would love to prototype an experiment with a little scenario. Okay, if you click agree, 5 years from now, this might happen. Yes.
You can build a web extension.
Yeah. I literally think this is I'm gonna like pitch this to my colleagues in Institute for the Future and see about what a cool.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Awesome.
I wanted to share a comment that came through on Slack and then a question for all of you. And then I'd like to open it up to anyone at any Mozilla office. We have boxes to throw around, asking questions, making comments. Please join the conversation. The comment came from Roseanne on Slack, who pointed out very correctly that we are not all Mark Zuckerberg, and that that responsibility and power have a particular relationship, and that we need to be realistic about the power that we have when we're ascribing the responsibility to the actions that we have. So that, I think, is a really fair comment for us all to reflect on, both that we may have more power than we realize, and therefore more responsibility than we realize, but also to not be too hard on ourselves for things that really are not within our control. And the question really came from the notion that an ethical OS is a lovely, lovely idea, but let's see if I remember the phrasing. But that what if we're all actors in an unethical system? How does Mozilla or any other nonprofit or allies around the world and in global policy arenas get to that point where we can disrupt the lack of ethics in the current system and start to build really better ways to move forward?
I mean, my quick answer to that is that what I've learned from the ethical operating system being taken up and used and evaluated, and what are its limits and what are its advantages, is that business models may ultimately be the strongest lever that we have, rather than technology regulations actually regulating business models. That's my short answer, is that we get out of this system that is fundamentally unethical by trying to change and regulate business models rather than the technologies themselves, because so much of the unethical action comes from how things are monetized or how certain aspects of capitalism work. So that's a short answer. And I will say, just to riff on the "we are all Mark Zuckerberg," that's a provocation, because I come from the Institute for the Future, where we believe that people have more power to affect the future than they realize. And I do like to provoke people to consider themselves both powerful and responsible actors in shaping the future. But I wholly concede the point that was raised, and thank you for it, because in reality, what you were saying is 100% true.
I guess maybe just to add to that, so rolling back to decades ago, there were organizations that were formed, like Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, where technology was starting to open up new avenues for targeted weapons, right? And there was there were nuclear weapons, things like that. And there was a set of computer professionals who were interested in at least discussing and sharing some of the ethical concerns, and then seeing how that could go out through the profession. And in some ways, so that organization doesn't really exist anymore, but we're starting to see that in niches in some of these places, like Partnership on AI, or places where people are starting to think more about the Internet of Things and what that looks like. I do think that we, in the end, I agree with you, I guess, that the fitness function for how you actually get systemic change is probably economic. And for the most part, that's just because So you can have legal regulation, which is ostensibly a representation of the ethics and morals of a society, except that that doesn't cross borders and boundaries, and the internet does. You can have systems that are, purely societal, again, doesn't cross boundaries, whereas the economic systems do. And so I think one of the questions that we certainly ask ourselves here, and I think a lot of companies are asking, is, well, what are the alternatives? And are there ways to actually create an impact and a new fitness function that is distinct from the existing ones?
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, like, it would be great if, like, Davos next year were totally devoted to alternative business models. Yeah, let's advocate for that.
I also think, like, I agree. I think regulation is one thing, but it's not enough, and it really comes down to companies. I'm interested, I don't know if there's research to support this, on the correlation between brand and company. Like, if people start to lose trust in what you do or what your industry or space does that impact profits at the end? And maybe the answer is no, so that's not a good model to pursue. I don't know. And I think, like, in the physical world, like, Cape Town was about to run out of water. The faucets were going to be turned off. And it was right up into the moment of crisis that people changed their behaviors. Not just individuals, but really that's corporate enterprises that had more impact. And Californians know, like, water is a big thing here too, and other parts of the world. But then some change happened. I don't know if that's sustainable or if it will run into another crisis, but I wonder how that, as time progresses, in 10 years from today, to your point, more people, maybe our economic models will have to shift. I don't know.
Okay, we have a couple more questions that I can ask online. And again, there are boxes, so whoever in any office is by a microphone box and look around and see if anybody else wants to speak and toss it to them. So there's an interesting question about individual agency and within a corporation. And I'm going to paraphrase you a little bit, MPK, because I think infiltration may be a little strong a word for what we're talking about here. But we talk a lot about going where the change needs to be made, but it's very, very difficult to see evidence that ethical people working in unethical companies can actually overcome that cultural barrier and make a structural impact. And by the flip side, we're curious what kinds of signals we might watch out for unethical people to try to infiltrate ethical companies.
Oh, I thought it was going to go the other way, where it was like everyone who's really concerned about these ethical issues infiltrates the unethical companies until there are enough people to strike or, like, really gum up the works.
That's whistleblowers, right?
Right. Yeah. Whistleblowers and chaos, chaos hackers. I guess to speak to the point of individual agency, one of the reasons why I'm excited about the EthicalOS is that I think it recognizes different levels of agency. There are different things that different types of people can do. And an individual employee within a company may not be able to change the business practices or the data practices of the company, but an individual on social media can raise holy hell about some personal experience they've had or a risk that they've identified and change the conversation. And within an organization, you can organize labor. There are things that different types of people, an investor in a startup can require founders to complete certain types of foresight practices before they hand over the money, that every actor in the ecosystem has a different kind of agency, and that if we empower every type of actor with more tools and the mandate and encouragement to do something, that there will be enough people doing different things. That is a theory that that we see kind of bearing out already in certain contexts, and I am optimistic that.
Could you give an example of where you see that building out?
Well, that's why I wanted to start with the duplex story, because I thought that it showed that the type of role that general ordinary people can play in requiring response. By having a public conversation and a social media conversation, we can demand that these ethical issues be addressed, and that people within organizations who were uncomfortable. I mean, I know people working within Google, when that came out and they started to see the ethical conversations, started to talk internally. Well, we would like there to be a response to this. We don't want to see our organization or our work interpreted this way. And then when you have policymakers starting to say, and that's also why I say we're all Mark Zuckerberg now, because I spent a lot of time talking to elected officials about this EthicalOS, and I'm trying to make them understand that they will be held accountable in the future, just as they're trying to hold technology CEOs accountable now. The next generation will hold the legacy of the policymakers accountable for not acting. So that's the sort of theory that I have, that we try to identify where different types of actors can make a difference. And if you have enough people acting in these complex ways, that it creates opportunity for ethical change.
I have another question about the relationships between two specific risk zones. Could I borrow the microphone? That risk zone 6 asks, could you build in ways to give users the right to share and monetize their own data independently? Has anyone explored the privacy as luxury implications of such a question? And in general, any enabling of users to monetize their data, which may allow more privilege to ignore such monetization while the economically disadvantaged, see risk zone 3, feel compelled to monetize their data. Do we see that happening, and how do we think about that tension?
Yeah, that's great. See, risk zone 3 was going to be my answer to that question, because, and also risk zone 2, actually. So in risk zone 2, we talked about the kind of emergence, and one of the scenarios in it is the emergence of a kind of new kind of digital divide, where a privileged set is limiting their engagement with addicting apps and, highly engaging apps, and limiting the data that's collected. And then you have this other, on the other divide, the people who are like full into the system, who might maybe for monetary reasons, because they feel like they need the free health insurance, or they need the monetization opportunities. So that is exactly the kind of conversation that we're hoping to generate by having all 8 of risk zones play together and intersect.
Do you see companies that are actually working out that balance well? That is, those two risks, I think, go hand in hand. And at the same time, you want to be able to support the ecosystem, right? I mean, even the luxury to contribute to open source sometimes is viewed as a privilege, right? Somewhere someone is paying for that. And so do you see companies, organizations, countries that are doing that well, that balance?
I mean, I've seen things, but in under NDA context. So I'm trying to run through my Rolodex of things that are not not covered by NDA. I mean, Miriam, you scan for signals. What makes you feel most optimistic about that anybody is actually making headway on balancing these risks and the benefits to society potentially?
That is a particularly hard question, because that is one thing right now that I am struggling really hard to be optimistic about, because there are just so many incentives stacked against really empowering any individuals to do that. But I think control over information is somewhere where we see a slightly more positive signals, and maybe a wedge for us to get control over one's data to actually happen. So I'm sorry. This is not a risk zone that I'm super optimistic about right now.
Without going into your NDA material, but do you have any observations on like what level of people are you seeing at companies that are triggering the conversations needed to make change? Or what is it? Is there some trends that, companies that tend to have a mission, and that comes in different forms, are doing this more than companies that didn't have some sort of guiding mission or statement? And so an example of that is there's a company, I can't remember which one, it's a tech company in SF in the Bay Area, and their mission is no shenanigans. And I don't know if that's a public one or an internal one, but I've heard just informally how that drives so much across product and other things, not just what you might think it is.
Yeah. I mean, I just, Salesforce and Microsoft give me a little reason for optimism. I mean, Salesforce just hired VP level chief ethics officer, which I was realizing I hadn't, that is a positive signal, I think. And so, and actually the person hired as the chief ethics officer was our partner at Omidiyar on EthicalOS. So, okay, that's a good step and outcome. That's Paula Goldman, their new chief ethics officer. And I think what Microsoft did with this manifesto for here are the types of regulations that we want to see around our technology, because we can anticipate Microsoft being held accountable for gross misuse and abuse of facial recognition. We do not want this technology to be so abusive or misused that it is regulated out of existence or socially becomes unacceptable. I mean, I'm like profoundly optimistic that there was a literal manifesto with we want these types of guarantees around transparency and right to contest and know when every time you've been recognized, get told that you were recognized and all of these things. I mean, that's great. And if every company making technology that could be used for harm took that kind of a bold public stance, that's good news too, I think. Yeah. And maybe it's a sign that like the financial incentives are aligning with ethical action, because they didn't do that because they're angels. They did it because they want this to be an incredible growth engine economically. So
they see that as part of their brand, right? Their identity.
Well, if they're going to make a lot of money off this tech, it has to be used widely. It has to be embraced and scaled and totally acceptable and invited in every space on the planet, which would only happen if it is safe and socially acceptable. So I think it's very forward-looking to say, please regulate us, please move slowly and help us not break things, because we want this to be the $1 trillion economic engine for us in the future. So, yeah.
And it is being pointed out that is a survival issue,
yes,
as well as a do good and be foresightful issue. Question from Kathleen right here. How open are you and your team to add new risk zones to your toolkit? We're thinking particularly of environmental and sustainability impacts, because that is one thing that we've been discussing over the past 2 years, investigating blockchain technologies, and finding that we're very, very uncomfortable with some of the consequences of that scaling. And so, which is one of the reasons why we are not currently building in that area. And so, curious, what do you think about that?
Yeah, we actually had the environmental impacts of blockchain technology as one of our founding ideas in this toolkit. And I'll tell you why environmental impact is not in there. I mean, it's in some ways, this is a totally stupid reason, but we wanted to focus on risks that are less popularly addressed or less on people's radar. And we just felt, compared to some of the other risks, that environmental impact is something that that companies already have, you know, task force and mission statements on. Now, are they, I'm not saying it's a solved problem, but that there is awareness that companies are expected to not trash the planet. So like I said, this may sound really stupid because when you actually dig into it, sure. Yes. 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 So I concede all these points, and just in the interest of transparency, I'm telling you the story of how environmental impacts did not wind up as, say, a 9th risk zone. We were trying to kind of keep it tight and figured there's conversation about that already, right? So that said, that's why it wasn't in there, even though it was one of our original signals that we wanted to address. We anticipate updating this annually. We invite and strongly would love to have this question is missing from the checklist. This risk zone is missing half the actual risk. Here's a scenario you should add because I just thought of it and I think it's important, and I want all the people who are engaging with this to put their collective imagination towards it. We want that. The toolkit's being used in ways that are going to be kind of like periodic. So we're doing a class with business students and design school students at Stanford now that we hope to offer regularly. And so this is the kind of thing where, you know, our updated material would allow us to keep getting out in front of people, especially the type of people who are going to come up and influence this ecosystem in the next decade and beyond. So thank you for that. And you should just anticipate that we're going to be on that. Thank you for encouraging us to go back to that particular risk zone.
Mostly, I would go back to the observation I made earlier. This is a little unfair. Some of this comes from the dissertation my wife did, so I did a lot of extra reading on it, which was narrative representations of environments, environmental crisis and toxicity and things like that. And privacy feels like something where people, if you look at the distribution of when that has impact on you, that could be tomorrow, but maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, if you're a teenager or something like that, but it's far away. And environmental impact, unfortunately, generally feels even further away. And so one of the things that I'm often looking for are the narrative tools to help us think about those. I do like, and Miriam and I have talked about this before, there are things like the catalog from the Near Future Lab, you know, where you are looking at some artifact that represents an impact a little bit in the future. My hope is that you will include the environment in some of the future things that you do. We're certainly have been thinking about it in terms of the impact we have here.
Fantastic. And I'd love to see artifacts also included in the next EthicalOS to have a couple artifacts featured soon.
And one more question from the internets and also from Kathleen right here. How can we ensure that our scenarios are also inspiring utopian visions and not just focused on the risks? We have talked so much about this, of what that dialectic is between showing something that makes you feel optimistic and showing something that calls you to be optimistic against terrible odds. So yeah, tell us how you think about that, how you balance that in your work.
Yeah, actually, the Foresight engine we ran on this neurosensing social network, we told that scenario through 4 different stories. And 2 of them were pretty positive and utopian. We looked at how biometrics and the neurosensing tech might affect social justice, political engagement, empathy for faraway disasters, where we just like we laid out some positive that this tech could actually be transformative for the planet in ways that allow us to be more human to each other, et cetera, alongside some kind of dystopian, more Black Mirror about like what does addiction to neurosensing look like. And so you know, it's a very common tool among professional futurists to have 4 alternative futures. So we told 4 stories, and you try to, in each scenario, have some elements of positive imagination and some of shadow imagination. And when we run the foresight engines, we require people to both play positive imagination cards, what could go right in this future, what would you be excited about in this future, and shadow imagination cards, which we ask you what could go wrong in this future, who would be disadvantaged or adversely impacted in this future. So we always ask people to exercise both sides of their imagination, in addition to trying to tell stories that reflect both sides of the imagination. EthicalOS is not super balanced in that way, although the toolkit, the third-party toolkit, which we didn't really talk about at all, are 7 kind of wacky ideas for like, what is the Hippocratic Oath for data? I mean, there is one for data workers, but for everybody else, or, you know, what does EthCon look like? How do we create this and start ethical bounty hunting? So we tried to end it with, here are some big ideas that would generate positive change. You know.
Are we going to EthCon? We are going to EthCon.
Awesome.
And I'll just add, I mean, one of the reasons, and this is very Mozilla specific, but I'd like to believe that it is also with people who are creators, right? Is that some of the optimism is inherent in wanting to enable people to do new things. I mean, we were mentioning sort of connecting in new ways, or empathy in new ways, or extending your cognition, right? All of those are things that give us new capabilities, and that's the hope and dream of a lot of the things that we try and create, whether that is, you know, letting somebody share their story from something in Toxem Square to being able to put the internet in their ears and ask any question. There's intentionally a lot of optimism in this, and so I guess what I like is that, and this puts the balance in the forward-looking work of it.
Right. I mean, the inherent baked-in optimism of technologists is, I mean, we lean towards believing we can make something that doesn't exist yet, that we are motivated by wanting to give people superpowers, and it is very, that conversation is inherent in a lot of the stories that we tell, I think, already.
Yeah, and part of the reason why I invited Mika up here is because when I was working at IFTF and training people in this futures thinking, one of my favorite groups of people to train were lawyers who want to say yes, as a group of people who make me profoundly optimistic, because usually you meet corporate lawyers and their business is saying no to things. But when you create these toolkits and checklists and things for people working in product and on the legal side to have really structured, really low friction conversations, it's much easier to get to yes, and it's much easier to start building those bits of the future that you can be optimistic about and see them and hold them in your hands. I remember the first time I got into hubs, the first time that I invited folks here into hubs. It's an experience of being in that future, and that experience is part of what anchors the optimism for me, even when I look out into the landscape and see some profoundly disheartening things. A few more questions. Let's see. Back to wide awareness exists for environmental concerns, pushing back on that a little bit. Contact here. How would we reconcile that wide awareness with the behaviors of VCs? And I would say I would blow this up even beyond environmental concerns, but gender equity, economic equity. How do we get the parts of this system that are pumping capital into things to think more about? I like Josephine on my team asked this, made this comment about the book Future Ethics by Sunil Boyd, and he says we should be thinking not how do we build this, but what shouldn't we build? How do we get the people who are determining what gets built to ask that question more often? How do we gain the upper hand in that?
I say, don't look at me. I got a bunch of VCs using EthicalOS. That's the best I can do. What are you guys doing?
Actually, arguably, it goes back to economics, right? I will confess secretly I am a Viridian. That is, I believe that long term.
Do you want to tell folks what that means? I don't think everyone is aware of.
It's just that, so they're sort of combined with biomimicry and a lot of renewable energy movements and environmental movements and technology, and it is this belief that rather than in contention, you could actually create a future where the environment and technology are enhancing each other, right? It's sort of an oversimplification, but a reasonable model for now. And I generally think that is true about humanity and society. 100,000 years ago, we invented this technology called language. And for better or worse, right? Maybe it created all kinds of things like wars, but in the end, evolving over time, we're actually able to take this technology and make it into something that has grown us into organized societies, enabled creativity, all of these different things. And so I'm generally hopeful about that. It's funny to call economics shorter term, but in the shorter term, it feels like some of the motivations for venture, the ones that succeed, would hopefully be about economics. That is, it makes sense to do something that is for the long game and not the short game. I mean, at the same time, I'm glad to hear that there are venture teams that are adopting the EthicalOS, because that gives some guardrails, or at least ways to think about it, or ways to seed it in the beginning.
And there's, I mean, as long as we're just talking about the wide range of interventions and possibilities, there's an op-ed in the New York Times today by one of their chief technology reporters, getting behind the idea that basically there should be no more billionaires in the world, and that it should be phased out, and that looking first at people who are acquiring that much capital in Silicon Valley and other tech companies as a way to stop the kinds of behaviors and business practices that are so toxic both to employees and society. And anyway, there's an op-ed about that's calling for no more billionaires. That's it. We're not going to have them on the planet anymore. If we can phase it out over the next decade, that might de-incentivize some of the practices that are so toxic. So, there are ideas floating around coming out of technology communities and progressive politics that kind of intersect. And I could certainly make a forecast around that and how that would affect technology companies. That would be interesting to consider.
Yeah, sort of on the point of how do we prevent big unethical things from happening. I think this is really interesting because I think society is in general we focus more on treatment than on prevention. So, and in this case, I think this is where individual agency really matters. And I can just think of so many examples working with products, even at Mozilla, and people might expect, it's Mozilla, and so they got my back. But it's individuals who see something and say, wait, actually, maybe this is a problem. Maybe we can do this a different way. And that starts conversations and leads to sort of the eventual change, perhaps. And I think it's really easy to, policymakers will blame companies. Companies will blame policymakers. I think economics lasts long term, but I also think individual agency lasts long term to be able to identify those points and say, well, actually, there's something else going on here. Is there another way? And I think that comes from all over every organization, engineers, product managers. It comes from many different places. And I think that's responsibility. And that's, I would love to see the environmental risk thrown on. And you invited me, sure, I'm a lawyer. You didn't know I'm an artist and I do some really crazy things. Like right now, I am not all the plastic that is not recyclable that goes in the garbage can. I fish it out after the family is sleeping and I clean it and it's storing. And I'm going to do something. So if you want an artifact for your immersive experience, but I think responsibility is there's individual responsibility too. It's not just government and company. That's my spiel.
Thank you. Would everyone please join me in thanking Jane, thanking our panel of Sean and Micah, and thank you all
Thank
of
you, Miriam, for bringing us together today and convening this.
Thank you. Goodbye, fellows and friends around the world.